bit more about what restorative language looks and feels like are able to lean into some of the nuances or ask leading questions to help them get further insight at the scene of a crime that they may otherwise not ask. So I love what I'm sensing about your group is that it's working towards a paradigm shift, because that's fundamentally in working with officers, the biggest thing that I am advocating for is that education. And once there is that education piece, then the referrals and everything else that happens can happen and grow from that space. So, thank you.
Thanks, Dana and Kathleen. I just realized that I hadn't started recording until just now. So sorry about that. And we're being joined by our other two people. So let me actually, before we go into our round of questions, let me just ask a question. You all both talked about the types of cases and how at first they were, low level, first time, young people, and now you all have expanded to some different, a wider range of cases. Could you say a little bit more about how that decision came about and how it evolved into a broader range of cases?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk just from what I have heard, because I wasn't around that far back when the shift happened. But my understanding is that it was simply based on success. Because the program showed such overwhelming success working with these low-level offenses with juveniles. Our police chief, fortunately, was open to more. He was someone who's very vocal about acknowledging the criminal justice system isn't the solution. That some aspects of the criminal justice system are necessary, but that we know that it doesn't actually reach our community goals for public safety. So he brought in co-responders, so mental health clinicians to be dispatched with police. We have a law enforcement assisted diversion program now. So he was a very progressive chief, to the point where even more recently, we haven't been taking juvenile marijuana cases, and I can talk more about that because I know that that's something of interest to you all, but he was really pushing back on me for that, saying we should be sending all youth to restorative justice no matter what. So we were just really fortunate to have somebody within law enforcement wanting more. And the other piece that I'll just add to that is we have a team of police liaisons. So officers are required to complete what they call collateral duty, like additional assignments, which they don't get additional pay for, but it helps them with promotions to take on these additional roles. So one of the collateral duties that's an option for them is to become an LCJP liaison, and they become sort of our main advocates within the department, and we rely on them heavily to help us with managing cases if we need additional information. If we have to have a hard conversation, a hard feedback conversation with an officer that maybe we don't know as well, our liaisons will help be the bridge, will help be the liaison in that hard conversation. And so they were really integral along the way for saying, hey, we need to do more with this. We know it works. We know the community is behind it. So let's expand our services.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one other question before I go for the question round, which is, well, actually it's kind of two. What has been the biggest challenge? What has been the biggest challenge in sustaining the program, and how are you all funded?
Yes, the big questions. The hardest thing for most RJ programs that I know of is sustained funding. And one of the reasons that we have lasted for so long is because we received, for some time it was $180,000, and then they increased it to $200,000 of funding from the city of Longmont, which comes from the public safety budget. So it's not necessarily a defunding the police model. It's not like money was taken out, but it is money from within the goal of public safety that the city has chosen to allocate to LCJP through a contract for services. And I have to say again that the reason that that funding was never snagged by some of the other community serving groups that always had their eye on it, frankly, is because the police chief advocated for it. He showed up every year in front of city council and said, this is something, this is a priority in this city. For us, there's, well, while that funding is amazing, there's always the concern that it might go away. So for us to diversify our sources of revenue as a nonprofit has been one of my primary goals and assignments from my board of directors over the last 5 years that I've been the director. So one of the things that, you know, in addition to all of the typical nonprofit things, right, grants and fundraising, events, we actually have a training program where we can provide contracted training at a fee for service, and that becomes an extension of our mission because we want to share our model and also a revenue generating source. That being said, I think one of the things that's important for you all to know as a challenge is this work is very difficult. It's very fulfilling, but it requires a very unique skill set. For someone like in Dana's position to be wearing a hat between families affected by crime, poverty, trauma, etc., managing those cases in partnership with law enforcement and managing volunteers to drive this whole process it's like a magic trick in many ways. I mean, there's so much work that goes on behind the scenes and so much self-work to be able to wear all those hats. And as a nonprofit, I, will say, I wish we were paying our whole team more. We struggle to pay people at the value that they are really worth. And so one of the outcomes of that is turnover. And every time we have turnover on our staff, that affects all of the relationships. The solidity, the credibility, and the trust that we have with officers that allows us to have honest feedback, which is really important for that paradigm shift that Dana mentioned. That's all based on knowing each other, right? Like, it's really hard to go have an honest feedback conversation with anyone, let alone a police officer who kind of works in a different mindset and culture than I do, if I don't know that person, right? If I don't already have some sort of established clarity around our relationship. Is there another question that I didn't answer yet? I'm getting all worked up.
It's all right. Yeah. Well, the only other one, I didn't ask it yet. It was just how you measure. Well, you talked about your measures for effectiveness. So yeah, and the impact. Yeah. So is the other. What else do you want us to know as we move into our strategic planning? And you might have said that.
I think, yeah, I can just say briefly, and then I want to just see if Dana wants to add anything. That I think upfront, knowing where your funding is going to come from, sustained, incrementally increasing funding for at least 5 years is really important. Like a grant that lasts 1 or 2 years is not enough. And then making sure that you have people who can put 100% of their effort into all of the groundwork that needs to be laid to get buy-in from the community. So like, I've worked with communities where the court clerk has been told, like, hey, could you just do restorative justice on the side? And these poor court clerks, I mean, it's so unrealistic to ask somebody to do that. So if there's going to be, volunteers involved, I would go plan for a full-time volunteer coordinator, starting with at least one full-time case coordinator and aiming for 2 as soon as possible. Plan for ongoing training, because this, you know, restorative justice to a certain degree is a science, but to a certain degree is also an art, and it will need to be modified according to the needs of your community and your stakeholders. So those are some of the main things I would say. Dana, do you want to add anything to my soapbox?
I would just add, you know, that it's important, I think, to find your champions, because as with any partnering between systems, I think that people inside of a system speak so differently than when an outsider comes in. So for me, working with officers, I can talk about restorative values until my face turns blue and, you know, get this. But sometimes when an officer or a police liaison speaks to another officer, they use words that I would never use, and they say things that would never come out of my mouth, but they hear each other. And so finding those sort of like core team members and then asking them to advocate and to bring you to be invited into a system is so different than standing there knocking on the door and saying, hey, can I come present? So yeah, finding your partners and your champions and helping them understand the restorative justice language, but then also being able to hear the way that they speak about restorative justice. I think that language piece is really helpful when you're working with stakeholders from different areas.
Okay, great. What I'm going to do now is go around. So we've got two questions in the chat, and I'd like to have us go around the circle and collect up questions, because I think one of the things that happens is when you hear several questions, you may be able to kind of combine your answers to them and so forth. So rather than have you answer each question as it comes up, we'll go ahead and collect them up, and then have you all have an opportunity to answer the questions, okay? So we're going to go ahead and Devanshi and Parissa have joined us now. So they're in the circle lineup right after JP, before me. And so we're going to go ahead and I will go ahead and pass to Jennifer with equanimity.
Thank you so much, Dana and Kathleen, for your time. Some of my questions were, you mentioned repair items. What boundaries, if any, exist around repair items that are offered to both victims and the individuals who cause harm? And how does your organization work to ensure they can meet those SMART objectives? You mentioned the parameters of traditionally 3 months, but for a violent crime from an adult offender, are there sometimes parameters that are extended much past 3 months? And then your contract is $200,000, but what is your overall yearly operating budget, and how many paid staff do you have? And I pass with open-mindedness to Lieutenant Washington.
Hi, I just had one question. I heard you say something about the restorative justice process supports mostly crimes against persons and businesses. What about crimes against the state or the county? And I pass to, sorry, Candace.
Thank you. I have a couple questions. My first was, you mentioned you do not do the restorative justice process with domestic violence and sexual assault, and I was wondering why. It sounds pretty intentional on your part, so just wanted to understand a little bit more there. I also had a question about whether or not you pay your volunteers or they get a stipend of any sort, and if not, how do you ensure that you have diversity in representation of your communities? Volunteering is definitely a privilege to be able to. And then my third one was, I was looking at one of the flyers that Leanne had handed out in advance, and it had the offender demographics jotted out. And it seemed really low for Black and Asian. And I mean, I went to school at CU, so I know that it's not necessarily the most diverse community to some degree, but it just seemed really low for those two. And so I was curious how you do quality assurance on, are certain people being referred and others not being referred, and what that looks like from the police lens of the QA. And with that, I pass with curiosity to Autumn.
Hi, a couple of questions. I know you said that the majority of the cases that you guys have are juveniles, and I just wanted to know a little bit more about that. Is that because it started out mostly with juveniles? And I know you said you take from 10 years old to 70 years old, but I just wanted to get a little bit more into why the juveniles are the majority of the cases that you handle. And I know you talked a little bit about, I think it was, I can't remember, but Dana, I think, talked about a little bit about the cons. I wanted to know a little bit more about, in terms of the surveys and feedbacks, what folks felt about having police be a part of the RJ circles, and if there were any sort of concerns about people being compliant because law enforcement was a part of that process. And I pass with kindness to Najla.
Thank you, Autumn. Well, thanks, Catherine and Dana, for sharing your interesting experience. It's very inspiring. And I think my question is, Dana mentioned a lot of the idea of language, the language of restorative justice with the police. So I'm just wondering if you can give us examples about the language of RJ with the police enforcement, how that looked like when it comes to the practice. And I agree that education is a big thing, and how to educate about RJ. So also I'm wondering if there's you develop specific training, specific set of principles. I'm just curious about what kind of education that you were engaged with with the police officers in order for them to be engaged in the RJ conferences. And thank you for sharing again your experience. And I will pass to Michael with wisdom.
Thank you, Najla. And thank you, Kathleen and Dana, for your time tonight. I just had a couple questions. I appreciated learning about the chief really being the driving force in the RJ program. I think that had an impact on how the community responded. I think it's also an important element. As Najla mentioned, I'd be curious to learn about what training officers receive, and more specifically, if you could talk to the implicit bias or subconscious training that they receive as part of being part of a conference. I also was wondering if you could speak to the power dynamic that occurs in the conference when a uniformed police officer is present. Do the participants feel like there is an element of compliance, and kind of how that works? And then lastly, it's a tough question, but it's something that's near and dear to my heart, but I didn't see a lot of diversity in the video that we watched. So like one of my peers mentioned, I just wonder if you could maybe talk to the demographic info. And I pass with open-mindedness to Lauren.
Thanks, Mike. Mike took one of my questions right out of my mouth. I had about, I know the model is based off of the officer referral, and I was wondering if there were any procedures in place to control for things like implicit bias. Also, and this is more of just a question for your experiences, but how long was the program in place before it moved from the more, I think what the video called lighter crime offenses to branching out into more difficult or complex, I will say, cases? For the case referral process, I couldn't tell from the flow chart online if let's say the responsible party doesn't contact the program within the first few days or whatever. Is there a follow-up? How many chances for contact are they given before it's then just sent back to the officer? And I think someone already asked about training, so that's the only one I have. Thanks. And I pass to Mustafa with kindness.
Thank you, Lauren. Also, thank you, Dana and Kathleen, for your time. I don't have a question at this point. My question was pretty much covered already. So I'm going to pass to Judge Lopez with optimism.
Thank you for speaking to us. It's really encouraging to hear you two speak about this, and your dedication really comes through. You talked about the length of time in the restorative process for the responsible party, and I looked at the timeline. I saw that some of it took up to 6 to 9 months. Could you discuss, please, some of the elements that are in the contract? Are there sort of standard elements that you have built in, or is each case so unique that you really come at it from a different approach each time? And to what extent does the contract look at addressing mental health issues or any sort of mental health treatment? And lastly, prior to entering into it, I think it was in the video answer, just want to make sure it was clear. Could you describe the nature of the confidentiality agreement that you have the responsible party enter into? And does the officer sign off on that as a member of the traditional prosecution team? Those are my 3 questions. And with patience, I pass to Katie. Thank you.
Thank you. I had similar to Judge Lopez, I had a question when individuals involved in the conference have mental health issues or addiction issues. So along with the question about treatment, I'm also wondering when somebody has a relapse or maybe goes off their medication, like how that's handled within the group conference. Are they, is there a process for that? I had a question about size of staff and budget, but that was asked, but how many volunteers do you have in your volunteer corps, and how many volunteer coordinators do you guys have? I had a question about, you said you're in the building with police, and you had said, I think in the video you had said how critical it was that that the organization not be a part of government, yet you're in a building with a government, and you specifically spoke to retaining, because you were able to retain the values of restorative justice. How do you, and what we have experienced, even with our staff that handle community service, is that they do start to take on the values of not so much a community organization, but of the legal system. How do you handle that being in the building with law enforcement? And I have 2 other quick questions. Just having leadership buy-in by the chief seems so critical to making this happen so quickly. Were there other leaders within the community that you felt were really critical to have on board? And just, speaking to that. And lastly, similarly, I noticed just a striking lack of diversity in the video in terms of who is involved in the restorative justice process. That's a huge concern for our group. And have you guys ever considered, one of the things our organization does is rather than having just volunteers from the community, having paid volunteers, because we want people that are working, we want people that might need money for transportation, and not just pull from privilege. So that's one question I had. Like, are there things you're looking at to increase your diversity amongst at least the volunteers, certainly the staff? And how do you see privilege being connected to the success in group conferencing? Like, because I see that in community service, like we run a community service program, I see a huge connection between being privileged and being able to connect with a place where you can volunteer, just success in general within that program. And so I'm curious how you see privileges as playing a part in both through race, through socioeconomic status, play a part in the success within your program. That's it. Thank you. And I pass with sincerity to Lucretia.
So most of the questions that I had have already been asked, but one thing that I guess in more detail would be in reference to the criteria. One was, I heard you said the officer, the person taking responsibility for the action, but then also for the victim to be okay or for that person being a part of the program. But my question is how, is it a strip, or how exactly are the officer explaining it to the victim? So does everybody have the same interpretation of what the program is and who is offered to? Because I heard earlier when we were talking about the officer's interpretation of who should be in the program, who shouldn't be in the program. Is it certain, if it's A, B, C, D, certain charges that would be appropriate, they determine who's going to be appropriate for the program. So I'm just wondering, because it was 1 and 2, the victim and the actual person that caused the harm. So I'm wondering, exactly how is it explained to the victim? Because if it's explained one way by one officer and something totally different by another officer, would, the victim may react differently to whether they want to be a part of that process or not. And I pass with wisdom to Mary.
Thank you. And thanks, Kathleen and Dana, so much for the presentation. I have 2 questions. One, Candace essentially already asked. I was wondering about the sexual assault and domestic violence cases. I couldn't tell if it was something you had tried and then decided against, or had just sort of vetoed from the start, and wondering about the reasoning for that. And then I think at one point you had mentioned a discussion you had with police about marijuana cases and whether they should be going, I think for juveniles, and whether they should be going through restorative justice. And I was hoping for a little clarity on that. I think that from what I understand, it effectively works the best when there's a harmed party. And so a lot of the youth cases where there isn't really a victim is maybe not ideal for RJ, but I'd love to hear more about how that discussion was and what you've done with that. And those are my questions, and I will pass to Amelia.
So Maren basically took out the question right out of my mouth. When I was sort of looking at the website and the list of eligible cases that you use, I was also struck by some things, distribution, possession, cruelty to animals, things that don't have an obvious victim. And so where you have done those, kind of how have you changed the process so that it has worked? And I pass to JP.
Thanks, Amelia. Kathleen and Dana, I greatly appreciate you sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us in this area. Mike and Judge Lopez both touched on the areas that I had questions regarding, so I will pass with respect to Devanshi.
Thank you, JP, and I apologize to everyone for being late to today's meeting. I think most of the questions that I had from looking at the materials from the information sent by Leanne have been asked already. I want to align specifically with Lauren and Jennifer's questions, and I pass to Carissa.
Hi, everyone. Devanshi and I were at the same meeting, which is, so my apologies as well for being late. I think everybody asked all of the best questions, so I'm going to pass with listening to Leanne.
Okay. This is a heap of questions, and I think there's probably some themes. I'm going to let Kathleen and Dana go ahead and dive in on answering those rather than try to bundle them up. So if one of y'all want to take, I don't know if you were taking notes, but I can certainly also ask you the questions if that's helpful, but.
I think I can. I think I can go through them, and I'm gonna go through my list and ask Dana to do some of them. So maybe I could answer some and then pass to you, Dana. Does that work for you? We can share. Okay, so I'm gonna have you talk about repair items, but I will talk about the budget, paid staff, etc. So our overall budget this year is just over $500,000, but as recent as 2016, it was under 400,000. So we've grown very slowly and gradually, which I think is pretty important in a nonprofit model. And while I'm thinking nonprofit model, for the question about our location and operating separately from the system from Katie, I want to just clarify. So we have actually 2 office spaces in one building that's a community building on Main Street. That's where I work. That's where our volunteer and training coordinator, development director, and admin assistant are. So we right now have 5 full-time employees and 1 part-time employee. Our part-time person is our admin assistant. Dana is our program manager, and then we have 1 bilingual case coordinator who are our sole community restorative justice program staff. And their primary office is in the police department for that contact with police. And they do have to do the mental, emotional sort of juggling all the time of upholding the restorative values while being in that environment, which is challenging and fatiguing. We aim for as much contact with our responsible and harmed parties to happen outside in our community space. So when we do the conferences, those don't happen in the police department. Our responsible parties are rarely coming into that office. For the most part, when we're seeing people, it's happening in our office on Main Street. And that physical distinction, as you referenced, is really, really helpful and really important, just as much for the program participants as it is for the staff trying to work in this framework. We have not gone into the model of paying volunteers, although I really love that you're thinking that way, because as you're noting from the documentary, we don't have great success in recruiting racial and cultural diversity amongst our volunteer pool. Our volunteers are primarily over 50 years old and primarily white, which is a problem. The demographics of the city of Longmont is just around 70% white. So to the point about the person who went to CU Boulder, it is a largely white community. Almost 30% of the city of Longmont is Latinx, and then less than 3% is Black, Asian, and all other racial identity groups. So our demographics of our responsible parties actually do match that demographic of the city. However, the city has just identified that we really need to look at, out of all police contacts, what is the percentage of each racial group that's getting restorative justice versus getting ticketed? Because of everything going on right now with racial justice, that's been identified as a priority by the city manager, which is really great, because that's a hard thing to ask for from the outside when the inside people don't want it yet. So yeah, I actually think that in terms of paying volunteers, we have done that in the past to stipend some of our more advanced facilitators to help coach our new facilitators. But I think that that's a great suggestion for trying to make it more feasible and realistic for a wider range of people from a different socioeconomic background to be able to access volunteering. We do pay contracted interpreters. That's something just in terms of this conversation about equity. We have professional contracted interpreters to help with our bilingual conferences, which primarily are English, Spanish. I'm going to have Dana speak to when there's no victim, crimes against the state or county. With domestic violence and sex assaults, there was a proposal in 2005, 15 years ago, to try using restorative justice to bring together victims and offenders of domestic violence. And interestingly, that effort by LCJP played into a historic tension between restorative justice practitioners and victim advocates around the sort of gung-ho attitude of restorative justice practitioners to bring together offenders of all types with victims and survivors. And it created a pretty problematic divide and tension where victim advocates developed a certain mistrust of restorative justice people because it was coming across at that time that restorative justice was not actually victim-centered. And so it's a sensitive topic, and I would acknowledge that at this point, because we're 15 years since that point, that was pretty edgy at the time, and now there's a way more people doing this work with way more models. There's restorative justice implementation on college campuses to address Title IX incidents, sex assault. So I think there's a lot more flexibility now. It's just something that LCJP hasn't revisited. We have, however, I think this is on your logic model. We have visited the idea of doing solely victim support circles. So many times victims and survivors of any sort of violent crime, but especially around DV, domestic violence and sex assault, experience harmed relationships within their circles as a result of result of their victimization. So we have been exploring the possibility of doing restorative circles with the survivor, with the people who they've had a loss of trust or loss of relationship with. The diversity in the documentary, yeah, so I've talked a little bit about what the demographics of our city are, and I will just say about the documentary, yes, it's a painfully white documentary. I will also say that it's really hard to get people to be in a film, especially people who have gone through the program, so that was one of the main challenges. It's really interesting. I did ask some of our volunteers who do come from a more diverse background across all intersections of identity to participate, but it doesn't necessarily come through optically. So yeah, I take responsibility for the appearances in the documentary, and will say that, yeah, it's really intensely white. Why is it mostly juveniles? Because by and large, a lot of officers are still thinking of restorative justice as an appropriate response to juveniles. So when Dana talked about really encouraging creativity, out of the box thinking, it's something that is part of ongoing training of officers to help highlight and lift up some of the non-conventional restorative justice cases and talk about how they've been successful when they're a higher level adult responsible person case. With police and conferences, I have gotten that question quite a bit about the power dynamic of having an officer in the conference and concerns about if it's sort of coercive to have the officer present, if that sort of has the same pressure of the punitive system because the officer is there. And I think, you know, there's a lot of nuance there that's hard for us to measure without being in the head of every single person who comes through the program. But I will say one of the things, so Dana and I both facilitate cases we mentor and coach other facilitators and do a lot of police training. We'll get to that question too. And there's something really critical about inviting officers to participate in a process where there's equal voice. So yes, they're typically wearing their uniform when they come into the room, but the facilitator is really guiding the process, and officers are expected to participate in the same procedural way that everybody else is. So they're answering questions when asked of the facilitator. They're asking questions when the facilitator opens the floor for questions. So I've had, officers who, for example, will suggest a repair item that seems really irrelevant to the case. And sometimes it's a great suggestion, like no being late to school or not missing homework or something like that. Like, it's not a terrible idea, but it's completely irrelevant in the context of the case. And we train our facilitators to just push back essentially and say, like, help us understand, how is that going to repair harm that occurred in this case? So if there's any sense of an officer sort of, we try our best to train them on the front end, but if there's any feedback that we get about an officer not participating appropriately in the conference, we address it with them. And that's sometimes coming from staff, or we get the help of our liaisons. We've had an officer make what we considered a pretty overtly racist comment in a conference. And so we followed up and had a conversation about it. And that's where those ongoing relationships are extremely important, because if we had never had a conversation with that person before, it would have probably not gone very well. I think that there's something to be said for the importance of community members to feel empowered to speak up during the conference also. That there really is, we do a lot of training with those community members, that if something's not sitting right with them, the purpose for them to be there is to say something, to name it and identify it. And that also helps create some degree of a power balance in the conference. I'll have Dana answer the question about the language of RJ, and also about if the responsible person doesn't contact us, how many chances, and also the question about confidentiality. In terms of our education on restorative justice with police, we try to provide training as soon as we can when they get hired. They are bombarded with training from their very first day of work, because they're supposed to understand how to handle every incident under the sun, which is problematic in and of itself. So we try to do an orientation early on, and then our ideal scenario is that an officer participates in a conference during their field training, which is sort of their probationary training period. When they're still in that field training, they participate with an experienced officer. So we don't drop them into the conference with no experience. We put them in there with someone who we think is an officer who does a really good job, so that they can learn from that officer's example. Having officers participate in the conference is the single most effective conversion experience for them to be open and amenable to restorative justice. So the officers who come in thinking that it's all about punishment, we're zero tolerance, or we're here to enforce the law in a certain way, and we're not gonna hold hands in a circle and do that thing. It's sitting in a conference that often changes their mind, because they realize that it actually does hold the responsible person more accountable than going to court. They also often comment on the value of being able to connect to the community through the conference and see better outcomes. They also notice that the people that they sit in a conference with, they often don't ever come into contact with on the street again. Then we do ongoing training every year. So if we can get into an in-service training, which would give us usually an hour to an hour and a half in front of every officer in the department, we will do that. If we're not permitted that time, then we go into briefings. Briefings that happen during every shift change between like morning, afternoon, evening shifts. So we will be given sometimes 20 or 30 minutes to do a briefing training. Frequency is really, really important. Every time we get in front of officers, we see an increase in our referrals. We don't provide, our program, Restorative Justice Professionals, don't provide implicit bias training to officers. They do have it through their formal training program. I think honestly, we all know that like a once a year implicit bias training is not enough. One of the things that I know anecdotally that I think is important to mention that's part of the solution is something that Dana mentioned about challenging stereotypes, that it's a small and subtle difference, but I will say that officers often tell me how their assumptions about people change because they've sat in a conference with them, and vice versa, right? Community members often talk about how they never thought they would have a friendly conversation with a police officer until they participate in our program. So again, that alone is not enough to address the challenges around implicit bias. But we do know that when our assumptions and biases are challenged, as we speak honestly, that can start sort of unpackaging the way that those biases play out. I'll ask Dina to answer about mental health and addiction. Leadership buy-in, I would go for anyone. The superintendent of the school district, others who are involved in student services. Having a continuum across schools and community is so important, especially as we try to disrupt the school to prison pipeline. Early on, LCJP had buy-in from the superintendent of the school district, the municipal judge, the chief municipal probation officer, the blessing of the DA, the district attorney. And those, not all of those relationships are as strong anymore. Some of those eroded over time. The school district in our area says that they support restorative justice, but what that looks like in practice is not necessarily up to our standards. The relationship with the municipal court and probation has been tenuous. We're actually trying to figure out a collaboration with them right now, but the paradigm and philosophy is very, very different about how to serve youth. Decision makers, so for us in the city council is ultimately they hold a lot of the power. So I do a lot of relationship work with our city council members and make sure they understand where that city investment is going every year. And then I think, as we're looking at this question of diversity, a lot of work needs to be done, and it's something that I think we could do better at LCJP, reaching out to some of our underrepresented communities and getting more education about what we're doing, especially groups that have historically experienced harm at the hands of police or have been excluded from diversionary options. Really important for us to make sure, like in Longmont, we have, our largest demographic after white is Latinx, and we have a certain number of people here who are undocumented. And something that we try to educate people on is that you can do restorative justice and not talk about your documentation status. We don't have to even ask that question. So we just want families to know that they won't be, their legal immigration proceedings won't be threatened at all by restorative justice. Let's see. Okay, so I'm gonna ask I asked Dana, I can also weigh in on this, but just so that I'm talking a little bit less, asked Dana to talk about privilege connected to success, which is a really great and important question. With how officers explain, so this is a great question too. Early on, we did have more of a script that officers used. They had a little like card with bullet points to remind them like what cases were eligible, what to look for, what to say. But over time, we've relied on the fact that the culture of Longmont Police has integrated restorative justice, so they don't necessarily need that script. However, it does definitely result in different officers saying things in different ways, which could determine some people having access to restorative justice or not. And how to encourage the victim. Some officers are better at it than others. Some officers would realize that our staff will be more skilled at explaining to a victim what the benefits are of the process than they are, and they will ask a victim to call our office or ask Dana to reach out to somebody. So there's a lot of potential sort of variance in how that's handled. However, a script also has some challenges too. So I actually didn't mention this before. You asked about what determined the change when we started accepting more cases, not just first-time juvenile offenders. And I actually need to find that out. I don't know the answer to that specifically. So I will research and let you know. Oh shoot, I was gonna say something else related to that. I'll just keep going for now. Be careful with time. With marijuana cases for juveniles, when I started at LCJP, I was a bilingual case coordinator, so working sort of at our entry-level casework position. And we were taking juvenile marijuana cases at that time. It was a large number of our referrals. And what we experienced was in our conference model, youth were coming through and were like, actually, I didn't harm anybody because I want to smoke pot and I like it. And we would get these reflection papers or these projects that they did as repair of the harms that were often just like further promoting their choice to smoke marijuana, which was not the intended hope of the conference participants. So we started changing our messaging to officers and said, you know, our model just isn't well suited for these cases. Now, because of having more resources, frankly, the organization is in really solid ground. We have begun the process of developing a restorative model where we can take those marijuana offenses of juveniles. It's not a conference model, it's more of a group model that focuses on social emotional skills, decision-making, and giving, working with youth with their voice and their agency and thinking through how different choices are gonna impact their own lives and goals. So it's restorative in a different sense, but not framed around that who was affected and how sequence, which we found not to be a great match for those juvenile substance use cases. Okay, I'm gonna pass it off with gratitude to Dana.
Dana, before you pick up, I just want to note, we're past the time for our break, and I think, I'm gonna, let me switch to gallery view so I can see people's faces. Is everybody okay with hanging in for a little bit so that Dana can go ahead and answer those other questions? I see nodding. Okay, if you absolutely have to run out, you know what to do. So, okay, Dana, thank you.
I would I'll just say I'm just going to keep it short and sweet, and I'll go ahead and put my email address in the chat. So if anyone wants to like continue the conversation or ask for clarification, I am available as an option. So short and sweet, our contracts include repair items that are completely individualized to the responsible person and their strengths. So we really focus on getting as far away as possible from the cookie cutter model of, oh, you did this, therefore here's the outcome for you. So facilitators are really trained to focus on the conference and kind of uprooting and identifying those harms. And then in the contract phase, connecting specifically to a harm that I heard earlier was X. What kind of repair does the group see possible, right? So that's what we're asking. We do have restitution. That's an option that comes through restorative justice. And when it comes to victim, I have a background in victim advocacy. And so a lot of the pieces that I bring to the program right now are working on concentrating our work to be victim-centered in a lot of ways. So we're really looking at, restorative justice offers no guarantee to a victim of crime. Let's be clear about that. There is nothing that is promised from the outset. The opportunity to participate in restorative justice is to have your voice heard in a way that is different than what happens in court, in a way that is different than what happens in other places. And so when I educate officers about talking with victims, voice is a central component. Now, no one is ever forced to participate in restorative justice. We have a surrogate program. We have, there are all sorts of models to help to meet the form that is best, that doesn't, perpetuate any harm for a victim in participating. Talking about the piece around officers and how they are describing restorative justice is part of the model. I just had a case where an officer told the victim, hey, when you get to the conference, you can throw as much retribution as you want out there, right? And the way that I hear about that is the officer calls me and tells me the victim is this is what I said, right? So it's in that moment where I can educate, right? What's the difference between a short-term and a long-term outcome? And so, like Kathleen had talked about, is like, I will do my damnedest, pardon my language, like to get in front of police to train them. But a lot of what the model has shifted to in the last year is working on these one-on-one conversations. And I'm finding that a method of triangulating is actually the best. So having an officer liaison with me, and then having a coffee break or 30 minutes where we can all talk about restorative justice, so that that person also has a point of connection within their own sort of like culture to get back to. Confidentiality, I'm happy to send out our form so that you can see how that's structured and how that works. Case coordinators are mandatory reporters. That's something that I tell people right up front. Disclosing that is really important. When it comes to how many chances you get, so the responsible person is asked to call in. Because we do victim-centered casework, we always call the victim. That happens first. The victim intake happens first. The victim pre-conference happens first. We're always really coming back to that. If the responsible person doesn't call within the first 7 to 10 days of the time in which, from the time at which the case is referred, then we go ahead and send a letter or an email out to that person. We put in a phone call saying, hey, we need to hear from you. We want to start the restorative justice process. If we don't hear from them a week after that, then we will again make a good faith effort to reach out to that person in whatever way we can. And then after that, if there's still no contact, then we will go ahead and refer the case back. The other piece that I wanted to mention around the way that officers are oriented towards restorative language is that all of our police liaisons, and we're going to now open that up to officers across the board in Longmont, are welcome to come to our restorative justice orientation that's done on a monthly basis. It's a 2-hour training, and we get back to the like big picture philosophy of restorative justice, so that that officer can have an experience of coming and immersing themselves in the world of restorative justice. So that is an opportunity that officers can come learn about the method and sort of take in some of the language up front. When there's no victim present in a case, there are, again, multiple forms of participation. So a victim could write a statement that's read in the process. They could nominate a representative who's an important member of their community to participate in their stead. They could ask for a surrogate victim. But when it comes to larger pieces of serving, business or county, we can look at victim impact statements that are written by community partners. But really what it comes down to is that when a victim is not present in the process, that is when we rely heavily on community members, because community members are there to name harms that may not be easily accessible to that responsible person in the moment. All right, I'm gonna stop here, but I will put my email in the chat, and we so appreciate all of your conversations. I wish that we had like the whole day together, because these are such awesome things. So just know that I invite the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana and Kathleen. It's been a real pleasure to have you here to answer these questions, and to really grapple with some of the pluses and minuses. So I'm going to suggest this. So I know Dana's going to put her email in the chat. I also happen to have it. So if you don't catch it and you need me to ask a question or send something, we'll do that. So what I'm going to do, it's time for a break. So if we go ahead and take a break, I wonder if we can come back at, it's 8:20, come back at 8:30, and we'll go through another round. But at this point, let's unmute and thank Kathleen and Dana so they can go on about their evening. So thank you, Dana and Kathleen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. We'll come back at 8:30, have a rest of our meeting. Thanks, Dana.